Few questions that probably all Pakistanis are wondering these days more than ever, with a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, a lot of hurt perhaps as well, are that what led us to this point? Where did we go wrong? What did we do to deserve this? Did we actually deserve a grinding halt? And will we ever come out of the crisis we're in? Because at this point of time, it doesn't seem to be the case. These are challenging times. These are desperate times for Pakistanis. The ones who can afford to have already moved out of the country. Those who can't, for some reason or the other, are figuring out how to move out of the country. And I say this with a lot of anger and hurt myself, because I don't think anybody loves this country more than I do. But the fact is that the complete structural integrity of Pakistan is at stake. And nobody seems to be bothered about it, to be honest. And when I say nobody, I mean the decision makers, people in positions of power. Your inflation has soared to unprecedented heights. Your unemployment is at an all-time high. The legal system has never been more compromised before. Your politics has descended into something you don't see anywhere else in the world. I don't think I'm articulate enough to describe what it's become. Then what? Your salaried class. Your salaried class is burnt out, exhausted. They don't know where to go with the pressures of these taxes. The level of grads being produced by your education system, at least the majority of them, are not at par with the world. Then what? There's energy crisis, there's human capital crisis, there's climate crisis. There isn't one aspect that seems to be going in the right direction. So no matter how big of a patriot you are, you start to question yourself. You start to question your own decisions. Why am I here? What am I doing? This is not the country I grew up in. What has this become? This episode of Sinkhorn is divided into 3 parts. So we'll have a look at the background and context of our not too old history first, and see if there have been any significant events that have contributed to this crisis. We'll then talk about the challenges and the problems we're confronted with today. And in the end, we will have a look at what the experts of the world suggest or propose to get out of what seems to be a never-ending crisis. Let's start. Okay, but before that, in order to understand this crisis or the economic situation, we need to understand Pakistan's geographical significance, because this has a huge role to play in it. Pakistan's strategic importance for the world lies in its geography. When I say that, I mean that we're at the intersection of Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia. We share borders with Iran, Afghanistan, India, and China, which makes us a very important player with regards to the regional stability, global stability, with regards to matters of trade routes, security interests, energy interests, global power dynamics precisely. This means that we're at a golden spot. But at what point did the golden spot's benefits give way to the kind of challenges that ended up damaging every aspect of our economy? Precisely 1979. In 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and of course the US had to respond. So they couldn't do it without Pakistan, again because of the same golden spot. The two countries got together to support Afghan resistance against the Soviets, and they created a counter in the form of Mujahidin. Who were Mujahideen? Mujahideen were people who were brought in from all across the region, and they were provided with the military intelligence, with the equipment, with all sorts of training by the two countries. And eventually, this collaboration proved decisive when, in 1989, 10 years into the war, the Soviets were finally defeated and sent back home. A decade of war had ravaged the country, leaving behind a broken system and anarchy. Warlords who had been part of the same tribe but been part of the same force against the Soviets turned against each other, plunging Afghanistan into a civil war. And this is the time Pakistan realized that this is going to be a big mess, because a lawless neighbor is always a threat, but a lawless neighbor is a bigger threat when you share an extremely complicated geography with them. So in the case of Pakistan and Afghanistan, that's the case. The Durand Line border, spanning 2,430 kilometers from the snow-capped Pamir Mountains in the north to the Arabian Sea in the south, traverses a diverse terrain of fertile valleys, deserts, and tribal heartlands. It slices through the Pashtun tribal areas as well as the Balochistan region, politically fragmenting ethnic Pashtuns and Balochs and other groups who basically inhabit on both sides of the border. So, a border or a concrete border, the conventional border, would mean that you're basically creating division between families, you're creating division between tribes. So it's extremely complicated. Just giving you a little bit of context here so you understand what's to come also, and why infiltration in the past has been easier, relatively easier at this border. In the mid-1990s, a group of former warlords, some religious clerics, and ex-allies of the same Soviet war got together and formed a force, which later became known to the world as the Taliban. Now, the Taliban would eventually consolidate power in southern Afghanistan and set the stage for events to follow in Pakistan and the rest of the world. The Taliban's rise to power in Afghanistan, coupled with the emergence of militant groups in the early 2000s like Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, transformed a regional conflict into a domestic threat for Pakistan. TTP, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, is basically a separate group that emerged out of Pakistan, but they're very close to the actual Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, and both these groups sort of protect each other. So on one hand, we see that Taliban are becoming stronger and stronger by the day, and on the other, we see that America's interest in Pakistan remained marginal post-Cold War. And this is the time when its relationship with India started strengthening. But then happens 9/11. And 9/11 is the time when Pakistan once again comes into spotlight. The US administration holds Osama bin Laden responsible for the 9/11 attacks.
We begin with the story of a shadowy multimillionaire who has declared a holy war against the United States. To some in the Islamic world, he is a hero. To the United States government, though, he is a terrorist, a real threat to the lives of U.S. troops. He is Osama bin Laden.
Osama bin Laden was thought to be in Afghanistan at the time. And in response to Taliban's refusal to hand him over to them, the US and allies conducted a series of aerial strikes in the regions controlled by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, this is when Pakistan once again comes into spotlight, yet again to protect the security interests of US and its Western allies. To gain strategic interest in Pakistan in the wake of 9/11 attacks and the US invasion of Afghanistan, President George W. Bush's administration designated Pakistan a major non-NATO ally in 2004. MNNA status is a designation under US law that provides foreign partners with certain benefits in the areas of defense, trade, and security cooperation. While the MNNA status provides military and economic privileges, it does not entail any security commitments to the designated country. Until the fall of the Kabul to the Taliban, the United States had 18 countries designated as MNNA. These included Argentina, Australia, Bahrain, Brazil, Colombia, Egypt, Israel, Japan, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, New Zealand, Pakistan, the Philippines, Qatar, South Korea, Thailand, and Tunisia.
In recent days, the whole world has learned just how ready they were.
The United States has the body of Osama bin Laden.
Eventually, Pakistan was forced into the reality of a war that effectively been imported onto its soil.
It was intelligence and action by US troops across our border. This is very much a sensitivity, and I think from purely political point of view and Pakistan's integrity or sovereignty point of view, it is not the right way of doing it. Many people have been asking whether it's all over for Al-Qaeda. No, I think that is a very, very simplistic view. This I would call, if I spoke from military point of view, it's a battle. It's a battle, an important battle has been won, but the war continues. The war will be a series of such battles, and we have to continue. The war on terror continues. It doesn't finish with Osama bin Laden gone.
Which resulted in the country's military, law enforcement, civilians all started becoming targets of brutal attacks, displacing millions and claiming thousands of lives. And while the Northwest's damage was massive and incomparable to anything else, explosions would happen all across the country. And when I say all across, I actually mean it. It was happening everywhere. We would literally say our last goodbyes before going out of the house. You just did not know if you're going to make it back alive. So I have a personal story to share here. Now, this was a time when the suicide attacks, all these explosions were literally an everyday thing. My mother and I, we were going somewhere. I was driving. This is the cantonment area of Lahore. And we hear an explosion, a massive explosion. And because bomb blasts and all these suicide attacks were so common in those days that you could tell if this was a big one. This was one high intensity explosion. The only unusual thing about this one was that we were in the Kant area and it felt like it was very close. It wasn't very far from Kant, which was unusual. We kept on driving and minutes later a relative calls and asks if my sister was at school, which she was, so we told them yes. And they said that there had been an explosion right next to a school and it's all over news. The first time in my life, I felt the kind of numbness that I cannot describe. Till date, I cannot. It literally just washed all over me. When people say that, trauma or shock freezes them, I literally experienced that. My body froze. And I remember we were in the Kant and I was heading towards the mall road and I pulled over. Literally no sense of direction whatsoever. And then minutes later you could hear the wailing of the sirens and ambulances and all those things. And we were desperately trying to reach out to the bus driver, my sister's bus driver. And we couldn't connect. I don't know how we got back home. Thankfully, hours later, she was home, safe. They were evacuated promptly. The explosion had been literally right next to her school. And the unfortunate students who left minutes earlier lost their lives to that bomb blast. Pakistan's war on terror was never a war of choice, but a war of necessity. A war that was thrust upon us by the consequences of a conflict that had spiraled out of control. A war that would test the country's resilience, its economy, and its people. For decades, Pakistan struggled with economic instability. This conflict would inflict wounds that would seem to just never end. The cost of hosting millions of refugees. The direct and indirect costs of fighting someone else's war are huge. Billions of dollars in losses, opportunity costs, and foregone investments would haunt the country for decades. According to the National Counter-Terrorism Authority of Pakistan, the human and financial toll of this conflict is staggering. From 2001 to 2022, Pakistan lost a staggering 83,000 lives to terrorism and incurred a financial loss of over 35 trillion rupees, equivalent to approximately $125 billion, or 37% of Pakistan's current GDP.
Allow the American government to have CIA here in Pakistan to conduct cross-border counter-terrorism missions against Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or the Taliban?
Absolutely not. There's no way we're going to
Seriously?
allow any bases, any sort of action from Pakistani territory into Afghanistan. Absolutely not.